A haven. Spirit Wolf wandered the forest, but he desired to leave it. He did not know how he would live outside the woods, where everything was known to him, but he wanted to live in a city. How he would hunt without being caught, he did not know. He did know he would need a job. Spirit Sower knew that his sons would need modern things if they wanted the earth, and he had gotten Matthew a social security card with a fake name. His day had been simpler, but he had told Matthew that all things are a compromise. Even moving west was not free from it, because he had to have peace with the Indians. The key to survival was not to be noticed, and not being noticed meant fitting in, and fitting in meant making compromises. Matthew fast walked through the plains and marveled that even at his pace, the vastness of the earth made him feel as though he were standing still. The tiniest specks on the horizon could prove to be gigantic grain silos as he finally approached them. He took the soul of one man whose car had a flat tire, taking most but not all of the man's money so it would not look like a robbery. He had no map and no idea where the cities were, but he followed the clues and saw one loom on the horizon. It was Denver. He couldn't fast walk much there because of the hordes of people crowding every corner, and his curiosity was not sated, so he continued, and he saw many more, one after the other, and they mostly seemed the same, until he came to one where there was no farther he could go, and he decided to stop. It was Boston. He got a job in a McDonald's. His pay was kept in arrears, and he had to light walk to the countryside to find victims for their souls and money. He struck a man and a woman as they drove past him. He didn't need two souls, but he thought they would have more money than one person. The car crashed into the woods as if they had lost control. He slept behind a dumpster and had enough to last until the first check, but light walking out of the city was problematic. He couldn't allow himself to be seen going so fast, so he had to start and stop and start and stop tediously. It was hardly faster than walking, and it took too long to make that trip on foot. He had to find a way to survive in the city. Once, someone tried to rob him as he slept, and the man paid for it with his life. But Matthew did not take the soul. He started to bring it in, but it was detestable, like rotten meat, and he took his hand away. He could see it as it weaved away, trying to see and hear. It looked like the combination of a shadow and a cloud. It would be an angry soul. McDonald's. He made friends with Marco, who made the fries. Marco was much younger, but helped him understand how to live on the street. He had to join a gym so he could shower, and he needed something better than a space behind a dumpster. What Marco didn't understand was that Matthew could remove his clothes and keep them in a plastic bag while he slept, because weather was no bother. He pretended he would sleep in a shelter. He didn't want to become well known to anyone, so he was cagey and distant with Marco, who eventually left him alone. McDonald's was tedious. It was nothing like the woods. He had a strict procedure, and there was always enough going wrong that he could never let his attention wander. Meat would come in patties, and he would stare at them as they cooked. He could feel nothing of the souls of the animals in them. The souls had fled. He built up some money, and he thought maybe sometime he would get a place to live and maybe even a girlfriend. But places to live were too expensive, and he didn't think he could tolerate a roommate. Even when he lived with his father, he would sleep anywhere it suited him, like an animal. He couldn't imagine returning to the same spot every night. But he could feel the hollowness inside him start to take his breath away. It was a slight need to take a deeper breath than usual once in a while. Fast walking then got more tiring. He knew from his 11 months of starvation earlier how it would worsen every day. He didn't want to keep relying on fast walking to the outside areas, but it was hard to see how he could get a soul in such a crowded place. So like a tiger, he observed. The search. He walked the streets at night after work. He followed people for hours, waiting for an opportunity, but they never seemed to get separated. The streets were never truly quiet. There was always a potential witness around, and even if one person was alone, another was bound to come around the corner, or a car would come by, or there would be a camera. Cameras were in parking lots, at people's houses, outside apartment buildings, and seemingly everywhere else. He started to lurk outside bars because they were the last places open. He noticed that when the bars closed at 1 a.m., he could be sure people would be on the streets, but they would be in groups. Some would take cabs away, some would walk away with their friends. Only a few would walk alone, and if they did, it was never to a lonely, deserted place. He also noticed that some people left the bar alone if it was earlier than 1. Usually it was for the same reasons. They would go to the tea or get a cab or an Uber. But sometimes people left to smoke cigarettes or make phone calls, and sometimes they left to take walks to clear their heads. Once in a while they would be drunk and would get lost, then finally find their way back, or give up and call for an Uber. They were never truly alone, but he knew sometime he would get a break. For weeks he followed, about 50 yards back, glowering from under a hoodie. First kill. One night, about 12:30, there was a lull outside Hennessy's. Somehow doors closed and conversation stopped at the same time, just by chance. Matthew, sitting on a wooden barrel nearby, suddenly felt like he was standing out. A man about 25 came out and went toward the waterfront, walking steadily but somewhat fast. Matthew followed. He went to the harbor walk and slowed down when he got near the water. Outside lighting lit up the area, but not too brightly, and he went along the walk as it went around the buildings that jutted out into the bay, occasionally looking at his phone as if to make a call and then thinking better of it. He went all the way past Pilot House Park, then to the corner by a parking lot. He climbed down to where there were large rocks where he sat, and this time placed a call. There were no stores or cameras that Matthew could see. He stood near the trees and watched. The man got agitated and stood up, talking a little louder. No one was around, and Matthew scanned again for cameras. He could see none except one in the parking lot, pointed in the other direction. The man said goodbye loudly, put the phone in his pocket, and stared out at the water. Things could not have been more perfect. Spirit Wolf got ready, put his hand up, and hesitated. He had thought of the woods the first time he had tried to strike. What had stopped him then? His hesitation was brief. He blasted the man right out of his shoes. Matthew approached to get the spirit, and he felt the warmth of its power flow through him. He turned and left, casually. The shoes would be found, and the man would float up eventually, but it would be hours before anyone looked here. With any luck, the shoes would be stolen. Matthew could hardly sleep for his pride. He would have liked to show Spirit Sower how he had pulled off a hunt right in the middle of a big city. The thoughts faded, and he thought of how it was a chilly night, but he was as warm as a baby in its crib. The perfect crime. Matthew stared at the sizzling patties and waited for anyone to mention the drowned man at the pier, but his coworkers said nothing. They didn't pay attention to the news, and it was frustrating to hear them talk about television shows instead. After work, he went to the store and bought a newspaper, but there was nothing about it. Only 2 days later did he see that a man had been reported missing and had been found floating in the harbor. It was 2 days after that he could find information from the coroner. The case had been ruled a drowning. There had been a high level of alcohol in the man's system. They noted that he had been found without shoes. The last people known to have seen him were friends at the bar. He had told them he was going home. He had spoken to a female acquaintance who did not live with him, and he said he was going home. His roommates had reported him missing the following day, 36 hours later, and the body was found after it resurfaced between two boats that were moored nearby. And so life went on. The lost life simply blew away in the winds. Matthew continued to work, and he kept following people. He followed people every day, whether he hunted them or not. He talked to Marco a little more often. They never spent more than a few minutes after work. Marco didn't like Matthew's standoffish nature, but when he wanted to talk, he took pity on him. By then, it was a long time for a regular-looking guy like Matthew to be on the street, and Marco tried to get information out of him, both from curiosity and from a desire to help. Matthew gave non-committal answers. He wanted to learn more about the person who had gone missing. He knew Marco could get that information on TV or with his phone. He also asked Marco about lakes or reservoirs near Boston. The questions were strange to Marco. "Dude, you need a phone," he said. But Matthew did not want a phone. His father had warned him not to get technology if he could avoid it. He understood that a phone would only leave traces of him. Marco explained that he could use the computers at the library, so that's where Matthew went. It was embarrassing to have to ask how to use computers. He didn't even know what the search bar was, and he typed so slowly that even the librarian remarked he must have never seen a keyboard before. But he learned fast. He found the man really had been forgotten. There was no mention of him in the news anymore, just an obituary that said he had died accidentally. He also found maps that showed places where there was water. He visited the Fens, the Esplanade, the Chestnut Hill Reservoir, the Jamaica Pond, and the Brookline Reservoir. He thought the Chestnut Hill Reservoir was perfect. It was near Boston College and had a lot of joggers. It was also near the T, so he wouldn't have to worry about light walking. But it was also easy to find a place to sleep in the wide, wood-lined fields nearby. Cityside Tavern was right across the street, and the nearest camera was at the Circle Cinema, which was barely even visible. A system. And so, 2 months later, as the hunger was making him hollow, he carried out another strike. With that thudding sound, a jogger splashed into the water, and Spirit Wolf had his soul. His next victim was at Jamaica Pond. That was the easiest. And then he waited 6 months and struck at the Brookline Reservoir. That was harder because it was so small. And then after 6 more months, he struck again at the Chestnut Hill Reservoir. All the while, he kept strictly to himself. He didn't need friends. The important thing was that he would have many, many decades to perfect his craft and many more to have friends if he wanted. He must take no unnecessary chances in his first city. His worries were soon vindicated. His first 3 victims had been found by the police, ruled drownings by the coroner, and forgotten by all. But the last one had been found by the news. One reporter saw a connection. He mentioned that in the past year, there had been 4 deaths in reservoirs of young men in their 20s. The reporter thought that it made little sense that they had drowned. The men were all strong swimmers. They were not suicidal. While 2 had alcohol in their system, it had not been excessive. But the really strange thing was that none of the victims had water in their lungs. The reporter wanted to know how they could be ruled drownings under those circumstances. "It appears," said the article, "the coroners may have deemed the deaths drownings because they simply had nothing else to go on." As if that wasn't bad enough, the reporter had contacted an investigator who had dealt with hundreds of missing persons cases, mostly in the Rocky Mountains. He noted that a decade earlier, 2 similar cases had been seen. Young people, a man and a woman in their 20s, had died apparently by drowning, but with no discernible cause of death. One was in the Chestnut Hill Reservoir, and the other was in the Jamaica Pond. He also mentioned that sometimes a smiley face would be located near a victim, which was true in 2 of the most recent cases. All of a sudden, it felt like the walls were closing in on Matthew. He wondered how long it would be before the death at the Harborside Pier would be connected. Matthew worked until he got his next paycheck and then left. He disappeared to the north. He had learned that 3 similar killings makes a pattern, and if that isn't noticed, the next one is bound to be. But something else was far more interesting to him. Who had killed the man and the woman 10 years before? North. He went north because he thought no one would think to go north. Most people would go to a large city to the west. Matthew went to Bangor, Maine. He found a job at a Dunkin' Donuts, and he slept at a rooming house so as not to stand out too much. It was one thing to sleep outside in a large city like Boston. In Bangor, there was no way for a normal person to survive the winter without going to a shelter, and he would be noticed if he didn't. Surprisingly, it was much easier in Bangor. In 2 years, he took 8 victims. 2 were near water and were thought to be drownings. 4 were in the woods, either hiking or cross-country skiing. He fast-walked 2 of them far away, and they were never found. The other 2 were thought to be hypothermia. Finally, 2 were older people who were ruled heart attacks. Their souls were of lower quality, but they aroused less suspicion. And then he left. 8 was already quite a count for a small city. But they were really 2 and 2 and 2 and 2. Never 3. Never a pattern. The car wash. He took his time to pick the next city, touring through several of the small Vermont and New Hampshire cities, and sometimes sleeping in the wilderness for a few weeks, for old time's sake. He also took 1 soul, which was incredibly easy in comparison with the city. All he had to do was walk the trails for a few days, and a man left his group to find something he had dropped. He stopped in Lebanon, New Hampshire, where he found a job at a car wash. He said he had worked at one in Cincinnati and gave a false employer. No one checked. He liked the car wash because it was less complicated than Dunkin' Donuts, where he hated making the breakfast sandwiches and waiting for the microwave to finish. The other employees had been teenagers who came and went and referred to him as the old guy. They saw him as an object lesson in what could happen if you were crazy and a little dumb. He also made more money at the car wash. His job was to spray cars down to loosen the dirt before they went into the wash. Very simple. One after the other after the other. It was too loud to talk to people. He made some friends. The others were less judgmental because they were older too, and they worked there for longer periods. People might easily be 40 and still work at a car wash, and the boss was at least 50. As he got experience, he got the more prestigious jobs, like greeting the customers and collecting the money, or, better yet, hand-drying the cars. It's the easiest job, and you get tips. The customers didn't look down on him as much either. His looks had stopped changing when he was 30, and at Dunkin' Donuts that made him suspicious and somehow defective. He could tell by the way people looked at him. He had sensed unease, just like the feeling his victims had when the sound went away in the woods. The only thing his co-workers wondered was why he would leave the West for a job at a crappy car wash. But he said there were no jobs back home, and that ended it. They would get sandwiches at a sub shop nearby and eat. "Where you live?" "I only ask 'cause you look like hell every day." "I just sleep outside, it's no problem." "You can't do that, winter's going to kill you." Matthew knew he would have to find a place sometime. It wasn't like Bangor, but it was still pretty far north. One of his co-workers, Gigi, said he knew someplace he could stay. It was a room in his aunt's house. She couldn't climb the stairs anymore and rented out 3 rooms on the 2nd floor for cheap. Matthew took a room and for the first time in months slept inside on a bed. His housemates still thought he was strange, however, because he never bought sheets or anything else for the room. He just slept on the bare mattress. It was drafty in that room, and Gigi's aunt turned the heat down at night. When winter came, it was as if the cold beamed in through the walls. You could hear the pipes clang as the temperature dropped, but he never bought blankets. The others, Ranger and JP, thought he would rob them and run away. Matthew was always warm, however. With Dartmouth College nearby, students in the prime of their lives were walking around everywhere. He could never be cold with so many souls, and he looked forward to a long stay. But he miscalculated. He took but 2 souls before, when spring came around, he chose the wrong one. It was a young woman hiking with friends who turned back on a short afternoon outing. She said her knee was hurting, and no one went back down with her. That should not have been a problem. It was only a mile back from that point. Normally the path was well traveled, and they were already close to the top of the hill and would be back soon. She would wait in the car and play music. His own fate. Matthew struck her and felt the sweetness of her feminine soul caress his heart. He fast-walked the body many miles away. There was no trace of her. There were no footsteps leading into the woods, nothing of hers left behind. But it would have been better to leave the body. The girl was very pretty, and her family very rich. He did not know that families at Dartmouth could be rich, so she was instantly in the news, and massive search parties were gathered. Many people in Hanover were questioned, then Lebanon. The police questioned his friends, and soon they would be coming for him. He could not disappear without becoming a prime suspect. He sat in his room, head in his hands. He called in sick through the landlady, but he knew that wouldn't stop them. He excoriated himself. How could he be so stupid? He was only a year into this life, and he was standing out. He couldn't go to jail. They would see him wither, as his father had said. He knew he could never take the detestable souls of criminals. If he did, their souls would drive him insane. He would not age or die, and they would want to know why. Her body was finally found, but that did not make the story go away. It reinvigorated everyone. How had she gone 10 miles? She was complaining of a bad knee, and she had been found on a ledge which was much higher than the hill they were climbing, and there was no discernible cause of death. Her body had simply ceased to operate. Her parents would not allow the story to drop. They had 2 autopsies done, neither of which found a definitive cause of death, and they pressured the police all the more to find answers. The police finally got around to Matthew, but by then, he had the perfect alibi. He couldn't account for every minute of his time that day, but he had been seen by Gigi's aunt at home most of the day. The trail itself was too far away for him to have even gotten there on foot in the given time, and there was no way he could have carried her 10 miles. So he was free. But now he was on a list. A large list, to be sure, but if he were ever suspected of something similar again, he would be matched to it. He smacked his head every night as he tried to sleep, cursing himself for being so stupid. Now he would have to be 10 times as careful. So he played along as if all were normal with his friends for 3 months, although he pulled back from them somewhat so they would not miss him. He gave the car wash 2 weeks' notice and Gigi's aunt a week, and was on his way with nothing but his backpack. He had learned the power of publicity. Everything came back to what his father always stressed. Don't stand out. Don't draw attention.